Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Draco Veritas. I don't know why I said it like that, but there it is. Alright, so, I am making, once again, my just kind of blanket trigger warning for the chapters here on out, just because this fic is going to get darker and darker and darker as the chapters roll by, so, if you are not, or you don't feel comfortable with things, like coercion or, deaths of animals, violence, or anything like that, then you might want to just sit this whole fic out. It is a very difficult one. But anyway, without further ado, let us just get right into it. Chapter 5. The Bone Orchard. Ron had been waiting so long there in their meeting place that he was about to give up. It was still full dark, but he could feel dawn coming, but couldn't be sure just how he knew. Outside, he could see the unmarked snow beneath the Quidditch pitch that shone like crystal. It was beautiful, but Ron regarded it with almost no interest whatsoever. He was tired from the pub crawl, and physically exhausted from lack of sleep compounded with stress and tension. But he had gotten used to that. What gnawed at him was anxiety. When he was with her, he was happy. When he was not with her, he wondered if he would see her again, and that made him miserable. She had been the one who had come to him first, but somehow along the way, the balance of power had shifted, and what had seemed like a game had become something else instead. Initially, it seemed like a colluded way of getting his own back, a revenge for slights real or perceived, but it hardly mattered now. Not for him, anyway. For her, he could hardly guess. She was risking a great deal, he knew, maybe more than he imagined, but she had come to him knowing the answer to the question in his eyes, and willing to give it. And in taking from her, he had somehow found he had given her everything. The keys to his locked-away secrets, the hopes buried at the back of his mind, the deepest and most desperate desires of his heart. She knew them all now. He could not have answered honestly that he knew the same about her. Sometimes she seemed to be hiding purposefully, keeping him at a distance, and in public, when she looked at him, her eyes said nothing at all. This other life of theirs might as well not exist. It made him want to yell and throw things just to get a reaction, assuming he would even get one. Harry had once told him that the worst feeling imaginable was to find yourself hating the person you loved best in the world. He wondered now if this was only because Harry had never known what it was like to love someone and realize you could not trust them. Surely that was worse. It had to be. A sound at the door made him turn, and he saw her coming into the room, looking pale and tired, her robes in disarray. "Ron," she said, and leaned back against the door, closing it. He saw she had his folded parchment in her hand. "I got your message. What did you want to see me about? You know this isn't a good time." He looked at her with slight incredulity. "I missed you." "You saw me today, and yesterday, and the day before," she replied abruptly. "There are more important things in life than sex, Ron." "That isn't the only reason I wanted to see you." He was gripping the table with his hands so hard that they hurt. She flushed beneath her pallor, but remained silent. He walked across the room then, took her by the arms, and kissed her, or tried to. She turned her face away from his and would not look at him. "Why?" he said. "Why are you doing this?" "I'm afraid," she said quietly. He shook his head. A strange ache had begun in the place below his ribs. It was hard to breathe. "I won't let you shut me out. I'll tell everyone." She jerked in his arms, as if he had dug a knife into her skin. "No, no, you promised. And you said you loved me. Or were you lying?" She laughed. It was a brittle sound. "I lied to everyone else. Why not you too?" "There's a simple solution to that," he said. "Tell them the truth." She seemed to droop in his embrace. "I'm not ready yet." "When will you be ready?" He searched her face with his eyes. As always, in the faint and colored light of the meeting room, she looked spectral, her features dim to ghostliness. He could almost believe she was not quite real, a figment conjured up by his own importunate yearnings. "Christmas," she said suddenly, surprising him, but then she always surprised him. He recollected how astonished he had been the day she first summoned him to this place. He had thought it was a joke. He remembered that she had been the one to kiss him first, hooking her arm around his neck and drawing him down to her, and he had let her, out of astonishment as much as anything else. Now she seemed shy, her hands knotted into fists against his chest, her head falling forward onto his shoulder, her hair covering her face. "We can tell everyone on Christmas, Ron, if that's what you want." "It's what I want," he said, and touched her cheek very lightly with the tips of his fingers. "Come on, Malfoy. Didn't you hear what I said?" "I heard you," said Draco, leaning against the door jamb and regarding Harry in a pained manner. His head had begun pounding since that evening, and he wanted to be alone. He kept seeing Ginny's face printed against the backs of his eyelids, the look in her eyes making him feel powerfully guilty. "I heard you," he said again, pitching his voice low. "You stole the portkey from Lupin's office. Nice work and all that, but, you know, he was going to give it to us after we got back from Christmas break anyway. Bit like breaking into Gringotts and emptying out your own bank vault, in my opinion. But I'm really, really tired, and I don't need this right now. It's 4 a.m. But if we go now, we can use this portkey and have it back in Lupin's office by tomorrow morning. If we get back by 9 o'clock, that is. That gives us 4 hours. Plenty of time, and nobody will ever notice we've gone," said Harry, his eyes bright with anticipatory excitement. "What about Hermione and Ron? Won't they notice you've gone?" "They're asleep." "I thought you liked Professor Lupin," said Draco. Harry looked taken aback. "I do. Of course I do. But this is important." "I don't know, Potter," he said, sneaking around. "Isn't this my area of expertise?" But Harry wasn't listening. His eyes were raking Draco's clothes. "You can't wear that. It's cold outside. Put on some real trousers or something." Draco stared at Harry irritably. "I'll wear whatever I bloody well please, Potter. If I choose to wear a fruit-covered hat, I don't see where it's your business." Harry blew out an aggravated breath. "Malfoy." "All right," said Draco. "I'll go now, on one condition." "And what's that?" "When we get back, you tell Hermione exactly where we went. I won't lie to her, not even on your behalf." Harry's head went up quickly, his eyes searching Draco's face. "Fine," he added quietly, after a short silence. "I'll tell her when we get back." "Okay." Draco went over to his wardrobe and selected a long charcoal-colored overcoat of silk-lined dragon suede. He threw it on over his pajamas and turned back to Harry, who was watching him with barely controlled impatience. "Ready?" he said. Harry held out his left hand, the box containing the portkey in it. It shone bright silver in the dim light that came through the window, and Harry's mouth was hard and set with determination, and for the first time in a long while, Draco recollected why the thought of Harry Potter had once made him afraid. He went towards Harry and stood beside him. "Hold on to me," Harry said, and Draco took hold of the sleeve of his jacket and held fast. He saw Harry tip the portkey from the box into his right hand, and then the familiar whipping tug took him, hurling him forward into grey oblivion, Harry at his side. When they arrived at Shepton Mallet, Harry announced that he would like to attempt apparition as a means to get to Doon's Hill. Draco nixed this idea immediately, stating that no one should apparate at 4 a.m., no matter how good they were. "A tired soul equals a splinched skull, Potter," he had said. Harry snorted. "One of your father's famous sayings?" he asked. "No," replied Draco. "I made that one up on my own." After this, Harry suggested that they walk to the train station, which was located in Shepton Mallet, but it turned out to be closed, and locked as tight as the forbidden third-floor corridor at Hogwarts. Harry had gone to look around, while Draco, miserable with boredom and cold, had flopped down on an empty bench and tried to read a Muggle newspaper that he'd found blowing about. When Harry returned, he found Malfoy staring at the paper with a strange look on his face. "What is it?" he asked. In answer, Draco turned the paper over and jabbed at an article with his finger. Harry cocked his head to the side, examining the indicated article, capped by a prominent headline. "The Art of Art Theft. Art theft is no longer just an illicit crime funded by unscrupulous collectors, but has become a billion-dollar industry linked to crime cartels and illicit arms dealing. The theft of a priceless medieval antique, including a mirror, reportedly valued at as much as £500,000, pictured at left, and believed to have belonged to Louis X of France, was taken from Sotheby's earlier this week, and is believed to be the latest incident in this trend, now worth more than £3 billion annually. The robbery at Sotheby's apparently took less than 10 minutes to execute, and was entirely bloodless. Within that time period, the priceless artifact simply disappeared, despite the routine sweeps by security guards. The prevailing theory remains that either the robbers must have been very organized, or they must have had help from inside. "We will be questioning our staff very closely," asserts Sotheby's head of security, Keith Fraser, visibly distraught by the recent events. "It is impossible that these robberies could have evaded our security systems without considerable assistance from someone possessing insider knowledge." When asked if there was another way the security could have failed, Fraser was indignant. "Well, I suppose they could have used magic." Draco crinkled up his nose in confusion. "I thought they didn't know about magic." "He's being sarcastic, you tit," said Harry, craning his head over Draco's shoulder to get a better look at the paper. "Why did you want me to look at this?" "See the mirror there, Potter?" Draco demanded, jabbing his finger at a color photograph of what looked like a silver hand mirror. The handle and back were elaborately carved all over with birds, flowers, and graceful whorls of silver. It looked very old, and reminded Harry a bit of the work on his Gryffindor scabbard, if slightly less colorful. "Yeah?" Harry looked sideways at Draco. "So what?" "So, that mirror was in my dream, that's what," Draco said, staring at the photo. "It's unique. I'd recognize it anywhere. As far as I'm concerned, this clinches the question as to whether the dreams are real. Now the question becomes, why does Voldemort want a mirror? If he's sending his wizards out into the Muggle world to get it, he must need it for something. And knowing him, it probably wasn't a gift for his dear mum." "Well," said Harry, and yawned, "if you want to know what it was about, you know what to do." "What?" Go to sleep and have another dream about it." Draco looked offended. "I can't just dream on command, you know." Harry turned away from him then, and looked up at the night sky, which was high and cold and as clear as a sheet of black glass. He almost imagined he could look into it and see no end. He spoke then, without thinking. "Aren't you tired, Malfoy?" Draco started, and looked up at him. "Always," he said. "Aren't you?" Harry shrugged. "I don't think I get to be tired." "Yeah," said Draco, looking up at the sky as well. "Maybe you don't." There was a brief silence, then he said, "So, where is the train?" "There's no train until 6 in the morning," Harry said, his cheeks suddenly flushed with embarrassment as he avoided Draco's gaze. "I guess we'll have to wait." "I bloody think not," said Draco, hopping down off the bench where he'd been sitting, and glanced around in restless annoyance. Harry shrugged and rubbed his black-mittened hands together. "Well, we can't take the train and you won't let me apparate us, so what do you suggest then, Malfoy?" "We use the port key and go back," Draco said. "Where does it take us? Lupin's office? Good enough for me. I might even be able to get almost an hour of sleep in." "No!" Harry exclaimed, and then more quietly, "No, there must be another way." "There is," said Draco, and Harry looked at him in confusion. He raised his left hand and snapped his fingers, and as he did so, he saw Harry's expression of confusion clear, to be replaced by what looked like panic. "No, Malfoy, not the—" He was cut off by a loud squealing and roaring noise, as a huge, hideous, triple-decker bus, with its splashy gold lettering, roared to a stop in front of them. The driver honked the horn, which sounded like a parakeet being strangled. Harry sighed in defeat. "Not the night bus," he said wearily. "What if they tell someone they saw us?" "Oh, bloody hell, Potter! Quit thinking you're the biggest news story since you. I'm sure Harry Potter Takes the Bus is not going to move a lot of copies of the Daily Prophet." Harry looked from Draco to the hideous purple bus and sighed. "I hope you're right." "I'm always right. Now get on the bus. You're giving me a headache." Draco was so exhausted that he barely took note of the pimply-faced young man who took his money, and was too cold to complain about the fact that he charged him a ridiculous 2 galleons for a bottle of water and a chocolate bar. He paid, then went directly to the back of the bus, which was deserted, and flung himself down onto an empty 4-poster bed, looking around him with concern. "What is it, Malfoy?" Harry asked, taking the bed next to Draco's and lying down on it. "Malfoys do not sleep on municipal beds," said Draco tightly. "How many other people do you think have lain on these sheets? Makes my skin crawl just thinking about it." "You're such a prima donna, Malfoy," said Harry, who had curled into his favorite sleeping position. "I can't believe you didn't bring your own 350-count cotton sheets on this little camping trip." "I could summon them," said Draco agreeably. "No," said Harry. "No more magic. Please. Especially not wandless magic. I really don't want to be noticed." "I was just joking," said Draco, and Harry lay back down. "They're satin sheets, anyway," Draco added, very quietly a few minutes later. But Harry couldn't have heard him regardless. He had fallen fast asleep. When the night bus finally came to a careening stop, it was nearly dawn. The sky had lightened enough to reveal heavy clouds, and the air tasted of impending snow. Draco was only too happy to disembark from the bus, and stood next to Harry, who was putting his gloves and scarf on, as the night bus roared away into the distance. They were on a country road, a slender lane of ice-dusted pavement stretching away between black lanes of bare trees. Along the left side of the road ran a high stone wall topped with spikes. The graveyard, Draco assumed. Harry finished pulling on his gloves and started off down the road. Draco followed, enjoying the cold air. The wall soon ended in a metal gate, chained and padlocked shut. Draco watched Harry as he thoughtfully touched his hand to the lock. "Alohomora," he whispered, and the padlock sprang eagerly apart under his hand. The two boys stepped back as the gate swung open, with a faint creaking sound. When they were through, Harry chained the gate behind them. They were farther south than Hogwarts, and here it had snowed much less. It dusted the tops of the headstones like a layer of fine powder, and sugared the bare, black paths between the graves. Draco had not been in a graveyard before. The Malfoys were all buried on the grounds of the manor, with cenotaphs erected over their bones. Something in the back of his mind, his old self, revolted at the thought of being buried like this, among strangers, not of your own blood. He glanced sideways at Harry. "You know where you're going?" Harry nodded and raised an arm to point. "Over there." It was still too dark for Draco to see anything properly, although the eastern sky was beginning to brighten with a few gray streaks of light. They went forward, their boots crunching on frozen dirt, and then Harry left the path and cut across towards the cemetery's far end, on frozen blades of grass. The only sign that this was a wizarding cemetery was the flowers that bloomed, unfading and unfrozen, on each of the graves they passed. Draco barely registered the names on the headstone as they walked by. Finally, Harry stopped walking. "All right," he said in a quiet voice. "We're here." And Draco's heart jumped for some reason he couldn't define as he looked. There were tall mausoleums in the graveyard, carved all over with angels, covered in Latin writing, and crowned with statues of Merlin and other famous wizards, dotting the landscape here and there. But the grave they stood in front of was a plain, gray double headstone adorned only with names Lily Potter on the right, James Potter on the left. Under the names was a Latin motto, Amor vincit omnia, and under that the date of death, October 30th, 1981. Draco chanced to look at Harry, who had gone very quiet. In the dawn light, his face was finely etched with shadows, his mouth an uncompromising straight line. There was a far-off look in his eyes, as if he gazed into some other landscape, another world dimly seen beyond this one. "Potter?" Draco said slowly, wanting to say something profound and interesting. Something comforting, something about the nature of life and death, and the importance of closure. However, no words came to his mind. He hesitantly took his hands out of his pockets, vaguely thinking that he should touch Harry on the shoulder, make sure he was all right. "Malfoy?" Harry said into the silence. His voice was very quiet, and his eyes now fixed on the headstones. Draco stood up a little straighter. "Yeah?" "If you don't mind," he said, his face still averted. "I'd like it if you left me alone here for a little bit." "Oh," Draco said. "Right." He put his hands back in his pockets, feeling suddenly awkward. "I'll just come back later." The other boy didn't reply. Draco turned then, and left Harry standing there by his parents' graves, in the pale light of the chilly dawn. Harry waited until the sound of Draco's footsteps crunching on ice had faded into silence, before he got down on his knees by the side of the grave. He looked at the headstones for a moment from his position on the ground. His father's name, and his mother's, beside it, looked as if they had been scarred into the stone. He read the Latin words under their names again. Amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all. He wondered who had picked it out, and could feel his own heart beating hard against his ribs, and there was a dryness in his mouth. But other than that, he felt nothing. Nothing at all. He had wondered if he might cry, but didn't. He stood up, suddenly dizzy, and wasn't sure if it was because he'd been holding his breath or just a reaction to where he was. The carved names on the gravestones seemed to be leaping out at him, printed blackly against his inner eye. He heard Draco's voice in his head, speaking to him in the cell under Slytherin's castle. "They've been there all this time, you know. All the time you were growing up, they've been waiting for someone to come and avenge them." He realized he didn't want to be looking at the graves, didn't even want to be near them, and he began to back away, moving quickly, until he rounded the corner of another mausoleum and was out of sight of them. Standing in a grassy square between 4 towering stone pillars, he leaned against the side of one and let his heartbeat slow. The sun had continued its swift and steady eastward rise, and the pale stone of the mausoleums were beginning to be tinged with a deceptively rosy light. Headstones stretched away in the distance, an unmoving and unbroken line, until he realized that someone was coming towards him along the path between the graves. Someone not Draco. A girl. Harry straightened up and stared. He remembered having seen her descending the stairs of the manor with Charlie on her arm, and thinking that she was very beautiful, if much older. One of those women so elegantly dressed that she seemed more like a doll than a person. Now, however, she looked very different. She wore a short, pleated grey skirt and knee socks, black patent leather sandals, and a soft blue sweater set. She must be freezing cold, he thought, although she gave no sign of it. Her glossy black hair was wound into long plaits that fell nearly to her narrow waist, tied at the ends with incongruously bright blue bows. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup. Her eyes were very bright. "I suppose you wouldn't believe me if I said I was just in the neighborhood," she said, still walking towards him. "No," he said, and took another step back. This brought him up against the side of the mausoleum, and he was forced to stop retreating. "You're Rhysand, aren't you? If you want Draco, he isn't here." "How fortunate that I wasn't looking for him then," she said. "I was looking for you." "Me?" said Harry. "Why me?" She was only about a foot away from him now, so close that her face seemed to fill the field of his vision. Her lips and depthless tunnel grey eyes drew his gaze. He wanted to look away, and didn't want to look away. "I just wanted to talk to you," she said, her mouth curving up. "That's all." "What about?" Harry was aware that his voice sounded a full octave higher than usual. She laughed. "How would you react if I told you that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since your birthday party, and that I just had to see you again?" "I'd say you were barking," said Harry, very nervously. Rhysand chuckled, reached up, and stroked his cheek, letting her fingers linger there. He felt himself shiver uncontrollably, as if it were cold, although he wasn't. "You're awfully cute," she said, the low timbre of her voice sending a pulsing vibration into his ears. "Did you know that?" "I've been told I don't," said Harry, and glanced around even more nervously. "Isn't it rather bad taste to be hitting on someone in a graveyard?" "Well," said Rhysand, and shrugged. "Look at it this way. You were depressed a minute ago, weren't you? And now you're not." "No," Harry agreed. "Now I'm concerned." "I get this feeling that you don't trust me," she said plaintively. "I don't." He tried to take a deep breath, but her heavy perfume seared into his throat, and he coughed. "Why should I? And more to the point, why do you care what I think? I thought it was Draco you were supposed to be bothering." "Bothering?" she snapped and pouted. "I'm trying to be helpful." "You could be very helpful by going away." She lifted her huge grey eyes to his. "You don't really mean that, she said. "And why do you believe everything Draco tells you?" "Because I trust him," Harry said shortly. He realized he was quite wedged into the doorway of the mausoleum at this point, and could not possibly escape without pushing her away. And somehow the idea of putting his hands on her body, even to shove her away, seemed like a bad one. "And what makes you sure that he's trustworthy?" Her breath ruffled his hair, and he shivered, his thoughts flying every which way like startled birds. This had never happened to him before. Usually when faced with danger or uncertainty, his mind sharpened to alertness. Now his thoughts felt fuzzy and muffled. "What are you trying to say?" he began groggily. "Are you feeling all right, Harry?" she asked, her eyes speaking of a different question, one that was laced with promise. He could almost hear the invitation inside his head. "I know you'd rarely like. We could go somewhere quiet, and we could talk about other things." Harry jumped away from her so violently that he banged his head on an ornamental angel. "Ouch!" he exclaimed. "What did you say?" "Oh, your poor head," she said, her eyes dancing with suppressed mirth. "Let me see." And she closed in on him and touched her fingers to his temple and stroked the skin there. He winced and tried not to breathe. But even with his mouth clamped shut, he seemed to be inhaling the perfumed scent that rose off her hair. It was like jasmine and sandalwood mixed with something stronger. He was very conscious of her shoulder brushing his, the swell of her breasts under the tight material of her top, the soft dent in the center of her bottom lip. He began hopelessly. "I don't think I—" "Shh, Harry," she whispered, moving even closer. And he felt her exhale against him, her breath stirring his hair. There was a tightness inside his chest that seemed to be growing in intensity, and a radiating darkness behind his eyes. "I won't hurt you," she whispered. "You'll like it." "Get away from him," said a sharp voice, cold and irritable, cutting through the grey fog in Harry's brain. "Right now." Harry opened his eyes. He hadn't even realized he had closed, in time to see Rhysand take a step back and turn around, her dark braids swinging. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, sounding like a little girl deprived of a treat. "Draco." Harry dragged his gaze up and away from Rhysand. He was not surprised at all to see Draco standing a few feet away, with his hands in his pockets, looking very annoyed indeed. His light grey eyes were fixed on Rhysand. "Honestly," he said, "have you no shame?" She smiled. "I was only having a little fun," Rhysand said cheerfully, flouncing towards Draco with her skirt swinging. This was a great relief to Harry, who found her continued proximity unnerving at best. "I was looking for you. I wanted to thank you for saving my life." Draco gave her an irritated look. "It was a reflex," he said. "Anyway, I thought you were immortal." "I am, but I can bleed. I can feel pain. And a lot of other things." "I bet she can," Harry thought irritably. "Yeah, and you were really fighting her off, Potter," Draco muttered back. "Now shut up and let me deal with this." Rhysand's dark eyes narrowed. "Are you two talking in your heads? I heard you could do that, but I never thought—" "Why did you follow us here, Rhysand?" Draco snapped, looking suddenly fierce. "Did you get bored standing around in your little cage? Voldemort not pushing enough food pellets through the bars?" The bright color in Rhysand's cheeks vanished. "What did you say?" "You heard me." Draco began to walk down the steps, and Rhysand almost took a step back before she seemed to recollect herself. "Call me crazy, but I think if you had a little wheel installed, you could work off some of that excess energy, and wouldn't be so driven to chase boys around the British Isles." The color had come back to her face in a flood. "How could you know?" she hissed. "I notice you don't deny you work for Voldemort," said Draco coldly. His eyes were chips of grey ice, making him look rather like his father. "Want to tell us a little about that?" Rhysand's fingers curved into claws. "You stupid boy," she snapped. "The Dark Lord will destroy you, and whatever minion betrayed him to you." "In that case, I'll just tell him it was you, shall I?" Draco suggested equably. With a scream of rage and whirl of black hair, Rhysand disappeared, vanishing without even the soft pop that usually accompanied a disapparition. Draco stood where he was, staring at the spot where she had disappeared. In the gathering light, there were no marks in the snow where her footprints should have been. "Hey," said Harry uneasily. "Malfoy. Thanks." "Thanks?" Draco jerked his head up and looked at Harry as if he were the most pitiful thing he'd ever seen in a lifetime of pitiful things. "What was that? I never picked you for the easily swayed by feminine wiles type." "I'm not," Harry replied, wishing he could be a bit more eloquent, but he was having trouble catching his breath. "I was trying to push her away." "Yeah," said Draco. "Maybe you were. But I think we should get out of here," he said. "The sky's getting lighter." "All right," Harry said. He took the box containing the portkey out of his pocket and opened it. It glimmered silver in the morning light, and Harry turned to Draco. "Hold on to me," he said, and tipped the portkey into his hand. The world upended itself, and then he was whirling away, shooting through a grey fog. Draco's hand knotted tightly into the back of his jacket. Draco landed on the hard stone floor with enough force that he lurched forward onto Harry, whose jacket he was still clutching. He let go and staggered back into an upright position, glancing around nervously. They were in Lupin's office. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light that spilled in through the half-open windows, illuminating the desk piled with books and a chair pulled up to the fireplace, which was empty and cold. He glanced at Harry, who looked slightly dazed. "Put the portkey back and let's go," Draco whispered urgently. Harry dropped the box onto the table, but as he did so, there was a faint noise. Draco turned and saw that the handle of the office door was turning slowly. Draco grabbed the back of Harry's jacket again, and he yanked him towards the fireplace. He pointed his left hand at the empty grate and muttered, "Incendio." Blue-white flames instantly wreathed the logs there, and Harry, realizing what Draco was trying to do, grabbed the box of flue powder that rested on the mantel and threw in a liberal handful. He leapt after the powder just as the door opened, and Draco followed him, grabbing onto Harry's jacket again so they wouldn't be separated. He heard Harry yell a destination as the powder spun them away. Other fireplace grates flashed by, some lit and some dark, and then the whirring forward propulsion of the flue powder spat them both out like objects hurled from a catapult. They rolled across a painfully hard stone floor, finally fetching up against something hard. Draco heard Harry yell in pain as he lay sprawled on the ground in a pitifully coughing heap. "Ow!" Harry said, still coughing. "Get your bloody leg off mine!" "Stop waving your arms around," Draco replied irritably. "You're getting soot in my eyes." "Well, good morning," came a bemused voice. "Nice of you two to stop by." Both Draco and Harry whirled around and stared. Draco saw the dark workrobes first, and then, as he looked up, a pair of leather gauntleted forearms crossed over a broad chest, and a very disapproving face capped by a mop of bright red, instantly recognizable hair. "Charlie," said Harry weakly, and then succumbed to another coughing fit. Draco rolled away from Harry and scrambled up to his knees, his eyes flicking around their surroundings. They were in Charlie's office, He recognized the bright Romanian embroidery on the walls, the bucket of dragon food, and, in its iron cage on the desk, the dragon itself, looking very annoyed that its morning feeding had been so cruelly interrupted. In the mirror behind Charlie's head, he could see himself and Harry, both covered in soot, their faces streaked, both looking very guilty indeed. "I can explain," Draco began. Charlie shook his head. "You know what?" he remarked in the general direction of the ceiling. "I don't want to know. I don't even want to know."
"Ron, eat something," Hermione said irritably. "You're giving me a headache, picking like that."
Ginny glanced over at her brother, who was indeed picking half-heartedly at his cold beans on toast. He also looked tired and slightly woebegone, his eyes darkly shadowed, his mouth downturned. "Ron, are you feeling all right?" she asked curiously. "Stomachache," he said briefly, and looked up. "Where is Harry?" "He wasn't in the dormitory this morning," said Seamus helpfully, and immediately all eyes turned to Hermione, who blushed the color of Ron's hair.
"I haven't seen him either," she said quickly. "He must have had an errand to run before breakfast or something."
"Well, if he doesn't show up for potions, Snape will skin him alive," said Ron, looking mildly thunderous. "Seriously, all this skipping class is going to catch up with him." "Since when do you care about skipping classes?" Ginny asked, feeling more shocked than perhaps she should have been. But honestly, it was like hearing Fred or George complain that they hadn't aced their divination homework. "Well, I am head boy, you know," Ron replied darkly, and went back to picking at his bacon. "Honestly, where the hell is—"
"Harry!"
said Hermione, dropping her fork with a clang. Ginny twisted around in her seat to see that Harry had finally arrived at the breakfast table. He flopped down in the seat next to Hermione, who was staring at him in amazement. Ginny found herself staring too. Harry was filthy. His normally jet-black hair was powdered even blacker with soot, and streaks of it decorated his nose, cheeks, and chin. His clothes were a disaster, and when he reached for the pumpkin juice, Ginny saw that his fingernails were gray with dirt.
"Harry," said Hermione in disbelief, "what happened to you?"
"Let me guess," said Ron, whose eyebrows had shot up to his forehead as he looked Harry up and down. "You may be a tiny chimney sweep, but you've got an enormous appetite," said Harry, grabbing for a plate of eggs and shoveling them onto his plate. "I'm starving." They all stared at him in amazement. It had been months since Harry had done much more than pick at his food during meal times.
"Harry,"
said Hermione, making an evident effort to sound patient,
"is there any particular reason why you're so—"
"So what?" Harry asked, glancing up faintly. "Dirty," said Hermione with finality. Harry looked at her for a second. Then he leaned across the table and kissed her soundly on the cheek. When he drew back, there was an enormous sooty mark on the side of her face, and her eyes were bright with surprise. "Hermione," said Harry firmly, "just don't worry about it, okay?" He flopped back down in his seat and attacked a slice of bread and butter with vigor. Hermione looked startled and remained silent. "It's good to see you eating, Harry," said Ginny, eyeing him as curiously as everyone else was. "Although I think you should dispense with the soot next time. It may do wonders for your appetite, but I for one don't like finding bits of char in my breakfast." Harry laughed despite himself. "That was funny," he said, and moved on to the bacon. "You're funny, Gin." Ginny raised an eyebrow and was on the verge of a retort when she saw that Harry had paused with his fork halfway to his mouth and was looking over at the Slytherin table. Draco was standing there, and while he was not nearly as dirty as Harry, Ginny could see that his robes were also streaked with soot. He was looking over at Harry very intently, as if he were trying to communicate something, which he probably was. Harry put his fork down carefully on his plate, and glanced at Hermione, who had propped a book against the juice jug and was turning its pages between bites of her toast. "Hermione," he said very softly, "could I talk to you for a minute?" She didn't glance up.
"Yes, of course."
"No, I mean..." His voice dropped even lower. "Alone? Outside?" Now Hermione did look up, surprise swimming in her eyes.
"Sure,"
she said, tucking a dark curl behind her ear.
"We could take a walk, I suppose."
Harry pushed his chair back and stood up. "Let's go." Hermione began to gather her books into her bag and glanced over at Ron.
"We have that meeting today, don't we?"
Ron nodded. "Yeah, right after lunch." Hermione nodded, then reached out to take Harry's hand before pausing. Shaking her head, she took her wand out of her pocket and pointed it at her boyfriend.
"Detergi,"
she said, and the soot vanished from Harry's clothes and hands, leaving just a grimy streak across his left cheekbone. Harry grumbled.
"Honestly,"
Hermione said, putting her wand away,
"you'd think you wanted to be filthy."
"I thought it looked dashing," said Harry, and took her hand. "Come on, let's go."
"I think there's something going on between Ginny and Seamus,"
Hermione said conversationally, as Harry tugged her along the path.
"That's good, isn't it?"
Harry didn't reply. They were at the perimeter of the lake now, on the narrow path that wound in between the stands of leafless trees. Bare and black, the branches rose into the sky, piled with sugar snow. Hermione wondered briefly where the giant squid went in the winter, when the snow drifts blew across the thick glassy ice, and everything seemed so cold and so dead.
"Did you hear me, Harry?"
Harry dropped her hand and turned to face her, standing at the lake's edge. The iced-over water behind him was spangled with glittering snow, the sky very silver. Against it, Harry's black hair and the red in his pale cheeks stood out like splashes of paint on a white canvas. His breath came out in puffs of white frost when he spoke. "Yes, I heard you. And Seamus is a great guy. Spectacular. I did him myself, but there was something I wanted to talk about you with, and it wasn't about Ginny or Seamus." Hermione blinked in surprise at his stern tone, then shrugged.
"All right. I wanted to talk to you, too."
"Did you? All right, but let me talk first, will you?" She nodded, a feeling of foreboding tightening her stomach.
"All right,"
she said, and sat down carefully at the base of the nearest oak tree, wrapping her cloak around her knees.
"What is it?"
Harry hunched his shoulders inside his cloak and was silent for a long time. Hermione sat where she was, letting him think. It always paid to be quiet and let Harry talk when he wanted to. "I know I've been distant lately," he said finally, in a very quiet voice. Hermione looked more closely at him, a bit startled. "Harry," she whispered, but he went on as if she hadn't spoken. "I wish I wasn't, but I don't know how else to be right now. When I was..." He hesitated a moment, seeming to gather himself together, then went on with the air of someone falling into a bottomless black pit. "When I was a kid and I lived with the Dursleys, I used to imagine what my parents might have been like if they'd lived." Hermione's lips parted in surprise. Harry never talked about his childhood before. Never. She remained silent, letting him continue. "I didn't know what my parents had looked like. I assumed my mother had been beautiful, that my father had been handsome, and that, of course, they'd loved me more than anything in the world." Hermione felt the backs of her eyes sting. "I'm sure they did," she said softly. "I thought about that car accident they were supposed to have died in, and wondered where they'd been driving from, where they'd been going. I told myself that they'd been spies, working for the government, that they hadn't really died. that they'd just been forced to go underground and leave me behind because the work they'd been doing was so dangerous. I told myself they'd be back to get me one day. I knew where we'd live together, what the house would look like. Blue, with every room painted a different colour, because everything at the Dursleys was the same shade of grey. His voice cracked a little. I furnished every room inside my head. I knew where all my toys would be, the names of the pets I'd have. I didn't live in that dark closet under the stairs. I lived in that house with my parents. Hermione realized she was crying and ducked her head so Harry wouldn't see. She wanted him to go on. I used to write everything down in an old notebook of Dudley's, said Harry quietly, looking out over the lake. One day, I was careless, and my uncle found it and read it. He dragged me out of my broom closet and shoved me up against the wall, and I still remember what he said to me. Your parents are dead, boy. They're not spies. They never worked for the government. They're dead. They'll never come and take you anywhere. They lived stupid, pointless lives, and they died stupid, pointless deaths. And we were landed with you. And all your dreaming won't bring them back. And that was that. He paused. I was 8 years old. Your notebook? Hermione whispered. I buried it, said Harry flatly. I knew my uncle was right. I could see it in his eyes. He looked triumphant. He wouldn't have looked like that if he'd been lying. His voice was thick with loathing. I despised him. But I never thought about that house again. It was ruined, and it was hard. Like losing my parents again. His words came out clipped and staccato. And then I came here, and I had another home, a real one, and I saw what my parents really looked like, and I knew that they had loved me, would have been proud of me, were proud of me. A world where ghosts walk and talk. I just assumed they were somewhere, watching me, that my father could see me fly, that my mother knew I'd faced a dragon, but they knew that everything I did, every day, was in some way an effort to redeem the sacrifice they'd made to keep me alive. Oh, Harry, Hermione whispered. I'm so sorry. The snow crackled under her feet as she stood, almost slipping in her haste to get near him. He stood and watched her, very alone somehow. She paused, hesitant to touch him, although another part of her ached to put her arms around him and hold him tightly. He looked at her, his green eyes haunted by a darkness she could not name. Hermione, he said, and his voice was oddly distant. What are you thinking? She took a deep breath, and her mind raced with all the different answers to his question. She wanted to tell him that she felt bitterly inadequate, incompetent even, that she could not be expected to heal that darkness inside him. She was too young, and the pull of it too great. Surely if she loved him properly, loved him enough, she would be able to help. But she already loved him more than she could imagine loving anything, and it was still not enough. Just that, she began. You have every right to be angry, and you so rarely are. That childhood with the Dursleys, it could have turned you into an awful person. Instead, it turned you into the best person I've ever known. I meant what I said our first year. You are a great wizard, and, more important, you're a good human being as well. He ducked his head, and she couldn't see the expression that passed across his face. No, he said in a slightly husky voice. I'm not as good as you. She laughed and took a step forward, and he raised his head to look at her. She reached out and touched his face, as she had been wanting to do, and he leaned his head against her open hand, as if he were tired. I don't know what I'd do without you, he said. The tone of his voice made her afraid, and she tried to look into his eyes, but he bowed his head down onto her shoulder and would not let her see his face. She kissed his temple, the only part of him she could reach.
"Harry," she whispered, "you never have to be without me. Never."
She felt him tremble under her hands, and then he lifted his face off her shoulder and was smiling at her. She did not quite believe the smile, although she could not have said why. "I know," he said, "but I have to get to class now, or Snape will have my hide."
"All right,"
she said, and let go of him reluctantly. "But before I do, didn't you say you had something to tell me?" She swallowed past the lump in her throat.
"It was nothing."
He looked at her, knowing she was holding back, and she returned his gaze. The chasm was still between them, unbridged, uncrossed. He leaned forward and kissed her cheek. "I'll see you later then," he said.
"See you later,"
she whispered, and closed her eyes so as not to watch him walk away. "And I think that's just about it," Ron said, flipping over the parchment he had been looking at and clearing his throat. "Unless anyone has any questions." Pansy Parkinson's hand shot up. "What about our books?" she demanded, as the spinning orb turned green. Ron blinked at her, then back at the parchments on the table. "Books?" "Leavers books, Ron," said Hermione, resisting the urge to pat him on the arm. "We have to decide on the design of our leavers books. They're important, after all." Ron rubbed the back of his hand across his eyes, and Hermione thought he looked awfully distracted. Poor dear, she thought. He seemed to be having a hard time concentrating lately, and had nearly forgotten all about the leavers books, which had been one of the topics of discussion for the day. "Oh, right," said Ron, obviously wishing he was elsewhere. Hermione's eyes slid past him, over to Justin Finch-Fletchley, who looked bored, and Padma Patil, who was industriously sucking a sugar quill. Next to her was Draco, lounging back in his chair as usual. Feeling her eyes on him, he looked at her, and their gazes locked before she looked away. "We need the motto to be engraved on the cover of the books," Ron began haltingly, "and traditionally every house chooses its own motto. Now, we have plenty of time to think of one, but if anyone has any suggestions—" "Malfoy." Draco started slightly, then subsided with a faint smile. "Well, we've got loads of mottos in my family, but I don't think they'd be anything you'd be interested in." "Try me," said Ron unpleasantly. "Well," said Draco, leaning forward and putting his chin on his hand, "there's always pillage before you burn. That's an old one. But one of my dad's favourites was, money can't buy you friends, but it does buy you a better class of enemies." Hermione then did the worst thing she could have done. She laughed. Ron shot her a very angry look, and she slunk down in her seat. It didn't help, she thought irritably, that across from her, Justin and Padma looked as if they were trying hard not to laugh as well. "Malfoy," said Ron, in a voice like shards of ice, "I want to talk to you in the corridor. Now!" he added, and everyone jumped. Hermione looked at him in surprise. His blue eyes were burning, and he looked well and truly furious.
"Ron,"
she began uncertainly, but he didn't even look at her. He was glaring at Draco, who was getting to his feet with a slow insolence that Hermione couldn't help thinking was a bad idea at the moment. He sauntered towards the door, and Ron followed after, slamming it behind them both. As the door of the meeting room banged shut behind him, Ron spun to face Draco, who was leaning against the opposite wall of the corridor, looking cool and unruffled, as if at any moment he might start examining his nails or checking his cuffs for minute specks of dust. "Malfoy!" Ron barked, and Draco looked up. His face was open and inquiring, his eyes wide and clear. He smiled at Ron politely, which only served to annoy Ron farther. "What the hell are you playing at? Are you trying to embarrass me during a prefect's meeting on purpose?" "No, that part was just for fun," said Draco calmly. "Maybe Harry thinks that sort of thing is funny, but I don't. I think you're an arse, Malfoy. A smirking, two-faced, insufferable arse." "Two-faced?" Draco laughed unkindly. "You should talk." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that I wasn't born yesterday, Weasley." "More's the pity," snapped Ron. "We could have started your personality over from scratch." Draco looked at him, a nasty smile still playing around his mouth. "I see the way you look at her," he said, apropos of nothing. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think we all are?" For a moment, Ron just stared at him. The blood had begun to pound in his ears, and his mind hummed with disbelief. Into the stunned silence, Draco slowly unhitched himself from the wall and stood looking at Ron with consideration. His eyes were an almost lucent gray in the faint light, the color of a knife edge, and just as cutting. "I was watching you this morning," Draco said. "I've been watching you for the few days now. Honestly, Weasley, what do you think you're playing at?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," Ron said, but he felt as if his blood had thickened. Everything seemed dizzy and distant and painful. "I think you do," said Draco even more quietly. His voice was sugar syrup poured over shards of ice. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." "I don't see where you get this idea that you have some insight into my private life. You wear your heart all over your face, Weasley," Draco interrupted, in his very slow and soft voice. "Which, in your case, is a bad move." Ron stared at the other boy. Rage was beginning to take the place of the shock that had paralyzed him. "You saved my life," Draco continued. "I owe you." "You've a funny way of showing it," Ron muttered, perplexed by this new turn the conversation had taken. "I'm trying to help you, Weasley," Draco said. "That's why I'm telling you that I know." "There's nothing to know!" Ron half shouted. "Not yet," said Draco, "but you do know what I'm talking about, so let me offer you a little guidance. Forget about it. Go on and glare at me like you hate me," he added with a shrug. "Doesn't matter to me, as long as you take my advice." "Why do you care?" Ron heard his own voice crack, rage making his skin prickle all over. "You don't give a fuck about me, Malfoy, and you never have. Am I supposed to believe this show of solicitude is for my benefit? You have no idea what you're talking about, so just sod off, will you? Go mope around after my sister, or whatever the hell it is you do for fun." A look of astonishment flashed across Draco's face, and Ron felt a vicious jolt of pleasure at having surprised him. The astonishment was gone in a moment, and Draco's mouth settled into an even thinner line. "Fine, Weasley," he drawled. "I suppose it's as I've long suspected, and your sole purpose in life is simply to serve as a warning to others." Ron glared at him. 20 points from Slytherin," he said. Draco's mouth fell open in surprise. "For what?" "For being a grade-A, all-around arsehole," Ron said savagely. "I'm going back in there now, and you are going to come with me. And I swear to Merlin that if you say one more word, I'll take 100 points from Slytherin. Let's see how the rest of your house likes you then." Draco lowered his eyelids, hiding his expression. "I guess absolute power really does corrupt absolutely," he said, and there was an undercurrent of mirth in his tone that made Ron itch to smack his face. Instead, he spoke quietly but firmly. 100 points, he replied. Draco said nothing after that, and followed Ron to the door without making another sound. Ron wanted to feel triumphant as they re-entered the prefect's meeting room, but all he felt was an odd sense of disappointment. For an insane moment there, he thought that Draco really did know everything, but he hadn't. Not really. And the burden of secrecy felt even heavier than it had before. He almost would have preferred it if Draco had hauled off and punched him in the face, which would not have been unexpected. With a sigh, Ron picked up his wand again and began to speak.
I've been doing that research we talked about,
Hermione was saying to Draco later, as the other students left the room, glad to be done with the meeting, chattering amongst themselves about what motto should be the one chosen for their class. Ron had left like a shot after the conclusion of the meeting, which worried Hermione, but she was eager to talk to Draco alone, and would ask after him later. "Did you find anything interesting?" Draco asked, his voice pitched low.
"Yes,"
Hermione replied. Draco leaned against the wall beside her and waited.
"Look at this,"
she said, and reached into her bag and withdrew a small gilded volume. She flipped to a bookmark page and tapped it excitedly with her finger.
"Does she look familiar?"
Draco leaned close and whistled. The page showed a woodcut engraving of a young woman in dark wizarding robes. Her hair was black and cascaded nearly to her feet. Her pale oval face was familiar, as were the upturned eyes and the smiling mouth. The girl held a wand in her left hand, and what looked like a jewel on the end of a chain in another. Along the bottom of the illustration wound 6 words in block calligraphy letters. Reese and Malfoy, in the year 1357. The engraved Reese stretched and winked at him, swinging her jewel on its chain. 600 years, said Draco, and laid a hand on the page. Well, she said she was older. In fact, she said she was immortal.
Well, that's not too surprising,
said Hermione. Why?
Because, according to her biography, she was engaged to be married to Nicholas Flamel.
Draco blinked, looking as if he were grasping at strands of memory. And he was...
a friend of Dumbledore's. He created the Sorcerer's Stone.
Hermione shook her head.
I never would have thought he would have been the sort of person who would have married a Malfoy.
Draco looked injured. Why not a Malfoy? They're extremely personable, you know. And then there's the sex appeal.
Oddly, her biography here doesn't say anything about sex appeal.
They probably called it something different back then, said Draco unflappably. Hermione snorted. Like what? Ye olde sex appeal? Draco ignored this. Well, I suppose it helps to know who she is, or who she was. Could they have brought her back from the dead, I wonder?
Necromancy?
Hermione whispered, although the corridor was deserted.
That's the worst magic there is. Anyway, it never works properly. There'd be bits falling off of her. Are there?
What? Bits falling off her? No, she's complete. Hermione rolled her eyes and shut the book.
I'll keep looking for information on her. Now that we know when she lived, I can cross-check her in the Flamel biographies.
Thanks, said Draco, then reached into a pocket and drew out a folded square of newsprint and handed it to her. Take a look at this, he said. Hermione stared at it in disbelief.
Draco, where did you get this?
Never mind that. Look at the picture. That mirror that was stolen from the museum? It was in my dream. Her head snapped up, and she stared at him. He was looking down at the photograph, his profile intent and serious.
Are you sure?
I'm sure, he said. Now the question is, What does Voldemort want it for? Obviously it can be used to see me with, but there must be a bit more to it than that. Any mirror can be turned to see me, if he really wanted to make the effort. Why that one?
Hermione shook her head. I don't know. The workmanship looks similar to Harry's scabbard, doesn't it? I know. I can check back to see who made the scabbard. See if the maker ever created any other enchanted objects.
She took the piece of newspaper and slid it into her book bag.
I can get some books out now. I have the time before ancient runes.
Draco gazed down at her, and a thoughtful look came into his eyes. There's one more thing I wanted to show you, he said. It's a bit strange.
All right, she said and glanced around again. There's no one here anymore.
True, he said, then strode to the door of the prefect's meeting room and bolted it. But it's better to be safe than have someone see.
Oh, all right,
she replied, not sure why she felt suddenly uneasy. Perhaps it was Draco's set, tense expression, or something else altogether. His grey eyes slid over her face, almost as if he were calculating, evaluating something, testing her. Whatever it was, he seemed satisfied, and he took a step away, reached down, took hold of the hem of his black sweater, and pulled it off over his head in one quick motion. Hermione heard herself gasp, and she stepped backwards, so quickly that she caught her hip on the edge of the table. Wincing, she exclaimed,
Draco, what are you doing?
He looked at her in surprise, and then his lips curled into an amused smile. I said I wanted to show you something. She regarded him with deep mistrust, trying not to look at the way his narrow waist flared up into a broader chest, at the flat planes of his torso, the faint tracery of muscles under the skin. Harry had much the same build, of course, light and lean, a seeker's body.
You didn't say you were going to get undressed, she hissed under her breath.
I need your magic expertise, he said matter-of-factly. I want you to look at my shoulder.
At your shoulder?
Here, he said, and indicated his left shoulder with a touch of his hand. Do you see it?
She shook her head. I don't see anything.
He raised an eyebrow at her. From that distance you couldn't see anything without binoculars. Flushing pink, she took a reluctant step closer to him and examined the indicated shoulder.
Is this where the arrow went in?
She asked with more curiosity than discomfort. He nodded, looking down at his shoulder. There was a star-like scar just below and to the right of the clavicle, quite healed. When Hermione touched it lightly, he did not wince.
It doesn't hurt? She asked.
No, he said, but do you see?
She nodded. It's glowing. Turn around.
He turned around, and she saw the scar on his back where the head of the arrow had exited his body, slightly smaller than the scar in front, but glowing with the same faint and phosphorescent radiance. She put her hand against his shoulder blade. The skin there was very white and smooth to the touch, a shade lighter than the skin on his hands and face. She could feel the slight roughness of the scar under her hand. It felt cold. She stepped back and dropped her hand.
It's glowing the same on the back, too. You're sure it doesn't hurt? She asked anxiously.
He turned around to face her, and to her relief, picked up his sweater and drew it back over his head. The resultant static electricity turned his silver hair into a crackling halo. It doesn't hurt, he said, pulling the sweater down, but it's awfully weird. I'm not happy about it.
I haven't heard anything about injuries that glow,
said Hermione anxiously.
Are you sure, Madame Pomfrey?
No, Madame Pomfrey, said Draco with such finality that she knew it was hopeless. She sighed.
All right, I'll see what I can find out, Draco. But if I don't find anything...
"Then I will continue to read in bed using only my shoulder for illumination," he said lightly, then glanced towards the clock on the wall. "I have to go. I have a meeting with Dumbledore," he added. "Wouldn't want to be late for that."
"No," she said.
"Thank you," he said suddenly, "for helping out." And before she could say anything, he had crossed the room, unlocked the door, and walked out. She watched him, and a moment later followed after, emerging from the room into the lighted corridor to see that Draco had been right to bolt the door. Someone had come down. Pansy Parkinson was standing in the middle of the hallway, her eyes fixed on Hermione. There was a look of such loathing in them that she was struck speechless, and could only stare. Then Pansy turned around and stalked stiffly back down the corridor, her back rigid with disdain. Hermione watched her go, feeling weak in the knees. She had always known that Pansy didn't like her, but what had she ever done to make the Slytherin girl hate her so much? Draco didn't know it, but his opinion that Dumbledore's office was possibly the most interesting room in the school was one that was shared by Harry. The headmaster had not arrived yet, and so he was at leisure to examine the fascinating objects that were everywhere. The antique claw-footed desk was littered with items of interest. There were a pile of chocolate frog cards on which the headmaster had apparently amused himself by drawing green moustaches on most of the famous witches and wizards, including himself. These were settled in amongst a pocket sneakoscope, a collection of singing mechanical canaries, a broomstick trajectory calibrator, a blank pillow pouch, and a sleeping dormouse. Draco moved around the desk, not touching anything, and then his gaze fell on a stand behind the desk, on which rested a familiar, worn, patched, pointy-topped hat. The Sorting Hat. He stood and stared at it for a moment. Then, without knowing that years ago Harry had once done much the same thing, reached for it with trepidation, lifted the hat, and put it on his head. Darkness enveloped his vision as the hat fell forward to cover his eyes. It had a musty smell, and he immediately remembered the moment he had sat on that tall stool in front of the assembled students, his whole mind a tight ball of determination, focused on just one goal. Slytherin, Slytherin, let it be Slytherin. The hat stirred on his head now, and a voice spoke in his ear.
"What have we here?"
It seemed to hesitate.
"You're older than my usual subjects, but I can't say I recognize the shape of your mind. Have we met before?"
Yes, Draco thought, perplexed.
You sorted me into Slytherin. Into Slytherin?
The hat sounded amused.
How very curious. Do you mind if I look a little deeper into your thoughts?
Draco hesitated.
"No, I don't mind,"
he said, then felt a shiver run down his spine as a most curious feeling took hold of him, as if something inside his head were fluttering. The voice spoke again.
"Why, you're a Malfoy. You're Draco Malfoy. I recollect you well. My, how you've changed. You're almost a different person now, aren't you? As if there were another you inside your head." "Something like that,"
Draco muttered, thinking of Harry.
"Yes, so what have we here? A good mind, sharp as a quill and twice as cunningly crafted. Quite a lot of arrogance and a nice dose of insecurity to match. You've known loss, and disappointment, and loyalty as strong as iron. You would never desert anyone you loved, yet those you don't care for might as well not exist to you. And you're not above using them to get what you want."
"Ah!" Draco jumped as laughter sounded in his ear.
You're a bundle of contradictions, young Malfoy, and the most interesting mind I've seen in years.
Thanks, said Draco aloud, without much feeling. So would you still... would you...
Would I what?
Sort me into Slytherin?
I might. You're cunning enough for it. At the same time, clever enough for Ravenclaw, loyal enough for Hufflepuff, and brave enough for Gryffindor. So the question is, my boy, would you still want to be sorted into Slytherin?
I don't know, Draco whispered, and added with a sharp flash of annoyance. It's your job, isn't it? Not mine.
What is?
To know where I belong.
When you're a child, you need someone to tell you where you belong,
said the Hat.
At your age, you should know it for yourself.
Well, I don't, Draco snarled, and yanked the hat from his head in a fit of vexed disappointment. I suppose I should have known better than to look for help from some stupid piece of talking haberdashery, he added, and drop-kicked the hat across the room, where it landed at the feet of Albus Dumbledore, who had come in very quietly while Draco was distracted. Oh dear, said Dumbledore mildly. Not much point taking things out on the hat, really. It doesn't feel pain. Draco looked guiltily at the serene-looking headmaster. You wanted to see me, Professor? Yes. Why don't you come sit at my desk? Dumbledore said, and Draco did as he was requested. He sat down as Dumbledore settled himself into the high-backed chair behind the desk and templed his hands beneath his chin. Draco did his best to return the headmaster's gaze steadily, but found he couldn't. Dumbledore's eyes were too piercing. It made him feel as if his own head were made of glass. Young Mr. Malfoy, Dumbledore said, I asked you here to tell me why you went to the top of the North Tower. However, he held up a hand as Draco began to speak. I know that you wouldn't tell me even if I pressed you for the answer. Although I am well aware you weren't meeting Harry, I understand all that. It's not why I called you here. If you're not going to ask me about that, Draco said slowly, what are you going to ask me about, Professor? I was going to return something to you, Dumbledore said. Something you lost. Draco's eyes widened. Yes? Dumbledore stretched out his hand, and Draco's eyes widened further. In the center of his wrinkled palm, something glittered blackly. A signet ring, carved out of onyx, in the shape of a griffin. My father's seal ring, he said blankly, and reached for it. I thought I left it somewhere. You did, said Dumbledore, at the top of the North Tower. I know your father was always so particular about wearing it. I am surprised you would have taken it off. He said it was time for me to wear it, said Draco, sliding the ring back onto his finger. He said I had become a true Malfoy, at last. Dumbledore sat forward slightly. His eyes were very kind. Is there anything you want to tell me, Draco? Anything at all? Draco hesitated, then shook his head. No, Headmaster. And I suppose it falls upon me to ask you questions, said Dumbledore. His light blue eyes had gone very grave and penetrating. I assume that you have noticed a certain change in Harry? Draco looked down at his hands. In the faint light coming through the window, the bones seemed highlighted through the skin. He thought of the way Harry had looked in the graveyard. I've noticed it, he said, and felt an internal wrench, as if he were somehow betraying Harry by admitting it out loud. But you might want to talk to someone else about that, like Hermione or Weasley, someone a bit closer to him.
There is no one closer to him than you, said Dumbledore.
Draco raised his eyes from his hands. I caused this, didn't I? He looked directly at Dumbledore, who knew, besides Sirius, what he had seen when he had died.
You did not cause the situation, only revealed it. And perhaps you think because of that you should be able to mend it. But you cannot, and he would not welcome it if you tried. In some way, you know what it's like to never really have had parents at all. But you cannot know what it's like to have adored those lost parents, to have turned them into the idealization of everything good in this world, and then to discover that they are in torment and it rests upon your shoulders to save them. However, I suspected that you might blame yourself for how he feels, and because of that, I have held back telling you something I have long wanted to tell you.
Draco blinked. Something about me? Or Harry?
Something about neither of you, and at the same time something intimately connected with both of you.
Draco hesitated.
Is it important? Yes, said Dumbledore.
Draco's heart had begun to beat hard in his chest. He had the feeling that important meant bad, and the look on Dumbledore's face only confirmed this. As Dumbledore began to reveal to him the secret that had been kept for almost 20 years, Draco chanced to look at the headmaster and was startled at what he saw. Dumbledore was looking at him with an expression of unutterable weariness. He seemed old in that moment, almost frail, his face very lined.
Draco, he said at last, I understand that I have put you and Harry in a terrible position. I know that, and I am sorry for it. I wish that there were more that I could do, but I am afraid that I cannot.
Headmaster, Draco said in a sudden burst. He was not in shock precisely, but stunned, his mind whirling. Everything around him seemed to have taken on a precise and sharp-edged clarity. Do you think I should tell him? Dumbledore shook his head.
I am afraid that is your decision to make, he said, but I would say that, yes, you should. It is never wise to hide things.
He sighed and shook his head again.
That is all, I suppose, he said.
Draco nodded silently, and the headmaster smiled at him. It looked like a real smile, if a tired one.
It is Monday afternoon, Dumbledore said, and I know you have an appointment in the armory. Go along and give Harry my regards.
Harry looked up as the door to the fencing room opened, and Draco came in. He hopped down off the table and came towards the other boy, smiling.
I wasn't sure you'd make it, he said. You're pretty late.
Sorry, said Draco, shutting the door behind him. He was still standing in the shadow, and Harry could see only the outline of him and the faint glint of silvery hair in the darkness. Dumbledore wanted to press me about my walk up to the North Tower.
And did you tell him?
No, Draco hedged. But he also wanted to give me back my signet ring. Apparently, I dropped it when I fell over. Anyway, do you want to practice or not? Harry nodded.
Sure I do. It's been a while.
He went back to the table and retrieved his sword, and when he turned back to Draco, he had already had Teramis S in his hand and was looking down at it almost quizzically. His face was oddly blank, expressionless, his eyes shining with a strange light.
Malfoy?
Harry said. Draco looked up quickly, his grey eyes lighting. Yeah, sorry, he said, came forward, and met Harry in the center of the room. They saluted each other and moved apart, and then back together, Draco advancing, Harry backing away and parrying as he did so. He wondered if there would ever be a time when he wouldn't hear Draco's voice in the back of his head as long as he had a sword in his hand. He had been quite patient in the beginning, explaining attack and recovery, parries and lunges. But Harry knew perfectly well he'd never have become as good as he had, as quickly as he had, if Draco's own knowledge and skill hadn't bled over to him through the polyjuice potion. He slitted his eyes now as Draco came forward quickly with a beat, feint thrust. Harry riposted swiftly, then began retreating, drawing Draco out. Draco knew what he was doing. Harry could tell by his smile, but they were just practicing, so it hardly mattered. Often they simply went on and on and on, until both or one of them tired, with nobody winning. Now Draco ducked and tried to get through Harry's guard, low line, and Harry smiled at the anticipated move and replied with a stop thrust, which the other boy should have been expecting. But Draco did not move at all to block the thrust, and Harry, realizing this almost a split second too late, wrenched his arm to the side. The blade made a sound like a whisper as it opened a slash along the side of Draco's sleeve. Harry, nearly overbalancing, crashed into Draco, who caught and steadied him. Harry jumped back as if Draco's touch burned, and realized he was shaking, and the hand that gripped the hilt of his sword was slick with sweat. "Malfoy," he said, "What? Why did you... I could have killed you. Why didn't you block me?" Draco's expression was almost completely blank. He looked down at his shoulder, where the rip in his shirt was already reddening with blood. Then he looked back at Harry, and Harry realized with a start that he was very pale, that his white blonde hair, his shirt, his clothes were drenched in sweat, as if he'd been running a marathon. "I don't know," Draco said in an unusually quiet voice. He walked across the room and laid Terminus Est down on the long wooden table, then put his hands flat on the surface. "I don't know," he said again, his voice almost too faint to be audible. Seriously alarmed, Harry went over and dropped his own sword on the table. "Draco," he said, "are you all right?" Draco didn't say anything. Harry stood where he was and waited, and finally Draco lifted his head and looked at him. His eyes were gray tunnels, going on and on without ending, and Harry could see into and through them. Could see Draco's bewilderment, rising panic, and pain. Draco took another breath. His shaking seemed to have eased a bit. "There's something wrong with me," he said. "My reflexes, they're off. I'm slower than I was, and I've been feeling dizzy a lot." "Well, you got shot in the shoulder. You lost a lot of blood." "Yeah," Draco said. "How long have you been feeling like this?" Harry said. Draco shrugged. "Since the accident." There was a long silence. "You have to go to the infirmary," said Harry. "Right now." Draco shook his head. "No, I'm not asking you. I'm telling you." A slight flicker of amusement lit Draco's eyes. "I'm not going, Harry. And I'm not so slow that I can't duck a punch from you." He held up a hand at Harry's furious expression. "Look," he said, "I already told Hermione, and she's looking into it. In case there was some sort of... well, something on the shaft of that arrow that hit me." Harry felt as if someone had walked up and kicked him in the back of the knees. "Like poison?" Draco hesitated for a split second, then shook his head. "That's impossible. I'd be dead already. It could be a slowing potion or an everation spell. Annoying, but fixable. And look, we're going home soon anyways. If it doesn't get better, I can get the best meadow wizards in the country to come to the manor and have a look at me. I'll owl Simon Bradford himself if I have to, so don't get your knickers in a twist about it." Harry ducked his head for a moment, and when he looked up again, he was relieved to see that Draco looked almost back to normal, no longer pale and strained. "I'm assuming that there have been cause for concern, Hermione would have told me," he said. "But I am going to expect you to see the meadow wizards when we get home." "All right," Draco said and straightened up. "I said I will, so I will." And Harry realized that he would have to be satisfied with that. He felt suddenly terrible and stared hard at the other boy. Over the months, he'd been able to read Draco's expressions, although they were subtle, and he could still feel a little bit of what Draco felt sometimes, if Draco was feeling it strongly. He felt it now, and saw it in Draco's face. Bewilderment and fear. "Malfoy," he began, but stopped as the door to the fencing room suddenly banged open, and both boys turned with surprise to see Hermione standing in the open door, clutching a book so tightly that her fingers were paper white.
"Harry,"
she said in a breathless voice, one Harry recognized instantly. Beyond her, he could see Ron and Ginny as well.
"Harry,"
she said again, and trailed off, and then her eyes went to Draco.
"Thank God you're both still here. I need to talk to you."
She looked down at the book in her hands, and then back at them.
"Can we go to the library and talk?"
Harry looked at her, trying to focus his eyes, but it was Draco who nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go." Once inside the library, they all sprawled around a table. Ginny, Ron, Draco, and Harry beside Hermione, who had her books and parchments spread out in front of her. She began talking at once, trying very hard not to rush as she went on.
"There are 4 worthy objects," Hermione said, "and they're very old. There's a dagger, a scabbard, a mirror, that one in the photograph that was stolen, and something I had issues translating, but roughly the word means cup. Each of these objects holds some kind of elemental magic, which is hardly ever practiced these days, but was pretty popular around Nicholas Flamel's time. Each object corresponds to an element, but that's not important. What's important is that these 4 objects are like 4 parts of a puzzle. They have to be brought together for the magic to work, and when they're together, then a ritual can be performed." She sighed and looked up from the parchment she was reading. "Draco saw that you-know-who had every one of them in his dreams, except for one, the cup." Harry cleared his throat. "I don't like the sound of that. What kind of ritual?" Hermione bit her lip. "It doesn't say. It only mentions that was what the objects were created for, to facilitate this ritual. I do know that blood is involved, though," she said, and wrinkled her nose. "But other than that, it's totally unclear how it all works. However, what is clear is the result of the ritual. When it's done properly, it will give the one performing it power over man and animals, over death itself. That's why you-know-who wanted the mirror, and that's why I'm sure he wants that final ingredient, the cup."
"I don't know," said Ron dubiously. "This all seems like a fantasy to me. I mean, some dreams, some photos. It might well be nothing."
"It might," Hermione agreed, "and right now the cup, wherever it is, must be in a safe place. But for how long?"
Ginny stirred restlessly in her chair.
"Speaking of photos, where exactly did you get that Muggle newspaper anyway, Hermione?"
Hermione looked at Draco.
"Yes, where did you get that paper?"
she inquired. Harry tensed as Draco turned his grey eyes towards him and narrowed them.
"You didn't tell Hermione where we went, did you?"
Harry winced and slunk down in his seat.
"No. I know I said I would, but I couldn't."
Draco looked squarely back at Ginny, and he smiled. "Would you believe me if I said I found it in the infirmary?"
"No,"
Ginny scoffed.
Hermione cleared her throat. "I think it's pretty obvious what we have to do."
"You mean like tell Dumbledore?" Ginny replied pointedly.
"No," said Hermione quickly. "Well, that is, not yet. Not until we have more concrete evidence."
She sighed and looked apologetically at Draco.
"And in order to do that, we're going to have to record your dreams, Draco."
Ron waved a hand. "I'm not following," he said. "How are you going to do that exactly?" but Hermione was still looking at Draco, who knew the answer by the look in her eyes.
With a pensieve, she said. We're going to have to make a pensieve.
She was waiting in his room when he got back from the library, sitting on the foot of the bed, one long leg crossed carefully over the other. As usual, from the top of her perfectly groomed red gold head to the tip of her school-issued Mary Jane's, she was perfect. "Blaise," Draco said, feeling the exhaustion that had been haunting his sleep like a cold pain in his bones. Now it wasn't really that. She launched herself off the bed and stalked towards him, her green eyes blazing. Before he could move or react, she cracked him across the face in a stinging slap. "Bastard!" she hissed. Draco fought not to wince. It had not been a good day so far. The trip to the graveyard, stabbed in the shoulder by Harry, the meeting with Dumbledore, and now smacked across the cheek by Blaise. He wondered what else the gods had stuffed up their sleeves as far as harm to his person was concerned. "Do that again," he said, "and I'll hit you back." She glared at him. "Draco Malfoy," she snapped, "I will not let you make me look stupid." "You look stupid," he said. "Impossible." She gave him a hard look. "Where were you this afternoon?" she said. "Why do you care?" "I'm your girlfriend! Where you are very much concerns me, especially when there was another girl running around demanding your attention." "Blaise, darling, you haven't the slightest notion of what you're talking about," he countered, his tone cold. "I'd consider dropping it if I were you." "Don't tell me what I do and do not know!" Blaise practically screamed. "I've seen her, and I've seen her looking after you!" When Draco said nothing, Blaise put her hands on her hips and glared at him out of eyes that were sparkling like emeralds. "If I don't know what I'm talking about, then you shouldn't have any problems explaining to me where you were this afternoon." "I had a meeting with Dumbledore. Not that it's any of your business." She looked indignant. "You expect me to believe that? Nice try." "Believe what you want," said Draco with a shrug. Blaise looked mad enough to spit nails. Her initial struggle was visible on her face. She wanted to believe him, and yet her inner cynic would not let her. When she finally spoke, her voice was slow and careful. "Give me one good reason to stay with you, Draco Malfoy," she said. "One." "I'll buy you something pretty," he said. She laughed. It wasn't happy. "Like what?" "Whatever you want." He took a step forward and put his hands on her waist. "That was that bracelet you liked in Diagon Alley." "I don't want any jewelry, Draco," she said, cutting him off. "Then what do you want, darling?" he said, chancing an endearment. He laid his hand against her cheek. Her skin was soft under his touch, her eyes enormous and lambently green. She was gorgeous, probably the prettiest girl he'd ever seen, and he felt nothing for her. Her eyelids fluttered down, her long lashes shading her gaze, and for a moment she rested her cheek against his hand. Then her eyes flicked back up to his face, and she stepped back and away from him, pushing his hands away. "Make me look like a fool again, and I'll rip out your kidneys and wear them as earrings," she said, "and that's a promise." "I thought you once said that Slytherins don't keep their promises," Draco said. "I'll keep that one," she replied, and turned on her heel. "You can count on it." And she stalked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. "She's not coming." He had already told himself this 3 times, but it didn't seem to make a difference. Ron stood up, easing his cramped muscles, and leaned against the wall, staring sightlessly into the middle distance. It was midnight, and he knew that keeping himself awake like this 2 nights in a row would tax his health, but he didn't care. Right now, sleep seemed like a distant and unreal concept. What was real was the fact that she wasn't here, and it didn't seem like she would be arriving anytime soon. He had sent her another message, telling her to meet him here again, and he had waited, but so far she hadn't come. He took a step forward and leaned his hands on the table. The 4 squares of light from the colored windows, blue, red, green, and gold, splashed across the center of the room, painting the floor. They glowed all the time, even at night. There was no need for other lighting in the prefect's room. Another reason it was such an ideal meeting place, and only someone with the password could get in. Of course, there had been that unfortunate Malcolm incident. Ron pushed that to the back of his mind. Malcolm didn't remember what had happened. An unexpected stroke of luck, that. Not that he felt very lucky right now. He got to his feet, feeling suddenly energized by fury. She had no right to act like this. He knew that they were prevented from speaking about this to each other in public, but she could have scribbled a note. Grabbing at the door, he wrenched it open, stepped out into the hallway, and hesitated. The corridor was filled with faint moonlight. It must be later than he had thought. In which case, well, there was no point in going to bed then, was there? And if he waited, perhaps she might come. They'd met later than this before. He went back into the room and shut the door behind him. Quotes. "We could have started your personality over from scratch" is from Blackadder. And that is all for this chapter, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. If you are new to the channel, welcome. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you are interested in supporting me monetarily, I do have a Patreon and a Ko-fi. They are linked here on the About section on YouTube. And if you just click, it'll take you through all of the stuff that I have offer on there. And anyway, guys, I've been talking for 2 hours. I am going to go do something else for a while. Thank you so much, and I will see you all in the next one. Good night.